So I have 1 o'clock. Kristen, do we have all the commissioners? I believe we do. Director Harrington, do we? I think we
Yes.
have.
We do. Everybody's
Yes,
on.
we do. Yep.
Okay, great.
We might just want to give Commissioner McCormick a second to get her cam on.
Okay.
Chairman, why don't you go ahead and get started? She might be having a
Okay.
tech difficulty and is rebooting. So just go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's call it the order. I'm Chairman Palmer. I'd like to hello, and I'm going to thank all of our guests and our panelists for joining this event today. The event today is for our listeners. It's called it's a roundtable discussion on E-Pullbook testing pilot program considerations. And I'm going to make some comments. I think the other commissioners will as well. Today's meeting is one of a series of meetings that we're going to gather feedback from stakeholders and experts on the EAC's pilot program on electronic pullbooks or E-Pullbooks. And these hearings will explore the needs, the considerations, the opportunities and challenges that the EAC needs to be aware of as we work toward establishing a pilot E-Pullbook program to implement what would be voluntary federal standards for the testing of E-Pullbooks against usability, accessibility, and security. The E-Pullbooks are what we would call election supporting technology utilized by election officials across the country. They manage and secure the voter lists and that process of verification, often used in place of or supplementing traditional paper poll books in the polling place. This technology allows officials and poll workers to do more than sign in voters at a location. It would allow for real-time updates, the looking up of voting locations, notification if a voter has already cast a ballot, or even allowing for early voting vote centers, other same day voter registration options where statute makes that available. These tools are one way that election officials are improving services to voters while also modernizing and improving the list maintenance procedures. As the use of this election technology goes across the country, so does the need for standards and the testing of security to improve and ensure security and accessibility. According to the 2020 EAC Election Administration and Voting Survey, what we call EVES, 1,991 local election jurisdictions, or over 30% of our jurisdictions reported using E-Pullbooks. 17 states used E-Pullbooks in all of their jurisdictions. While the use of E-Pullbooks has expanded, testing and certification of this technology varies considerably state by state. And so the EAC recognizes this gap and has started the development of this program to assist election officials as they continue and expand the use of their E-Pullbooks. Our hope is that these national standards will create efficiencies and cost savings for election administrators as well as the E-Pullbook administrators. So we value the feedback from election officials. Part of today's discussion is an information gathering process, and we hope to hear from officials in states and localities that have certification programs, as well as states or jurisdictions that don't require certification, but have procedures or reviews around E-Pullbooks. We'll have a discussion today that will assist the commission, I hope, in better understanding how to address potential challenges, and ultimately, we want to ensure this program is a success. In addition to feedback from election officials, another critical voice on this topic is the manufacturers themselves. And today we also hope to hear from the manufacturers and give us a better understanding of their current experiences with existing state certification programs, ideas for the EAC to continue to develop a pilot program, and their thoughts on other considerations the agency should be aware of. The EAC is committed to providing a program that best serves the needs of election officials, keeping the costs down, making security standards robust, and ensuring accessibility factors are also taken into consideration. We are still crafting this program and want to make sure it fits the need of our stakeholders and serves the purpose of securing this valuable election technology. Today's event is the first of many, and EAC is committed to transparency and agility as we move forward. With that, I'm going to transition to Vice Chair Thomas Hicks for his opening comments and the other commissioners. Vice Chair Hicks.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer. You noted two important stakeholders in this process, and I look forward to hearing from them and election officials and voting system manufacturers joining us today concerning E-Pullbook testing. Voting system test laboratories, or VISTLs, SOI and ProV&V, are also here to speak on their roles in E-Pullbooks. VISTLs have worked with the EAC in the certification of voting systems, but they also play a role in the work already being done to test E-Pullbooks for various jurisdictions. I'm very interested to hear from the VISTLs on their work in E-Pullbooks and how to urge states to participate in this vital process. Our questions for them today will explore the preparedness for expanding their current services and understanding what a pilot program should entail. I would like to thank them for joining us here today and sharing their thoughts on this critical work. And I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hicks. Commissioner McCormick. You're still on mute, Commissioner McCormick.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer. I appreciate the opportunity to give a few remarks and look forward to asking questions of our panelists today. As you noted in your opening remarks, the certification of E-Pullbooks varies by state. The research shows that of the 40 states that use E-Pullbooks in at least one jurisdiction, 13 certify E-Pullbooks, 12 have statewide procedures, but not a formal certification program, and 12 don't fit into either category. However, E-Pullbook usage is authorized in the 12 states that do not fit in either category. Legislation concerning E-Pullbooks has been passed across the country over the last few years, ranging from the certification of this technology to authorization of their use. As with most things in elections, this too varies by state, and some laws are stricter than others. By creating a pilot program to test E-Pullbooks, we hope to tie together what is working well for our stakeholders to improve security and accessibility while accounting for cost and efficiency concerns. I hope the steps the EAC is making will help election officials as they continue to utilize this technology. And I look forward to today's discussion. Thank you, Chairman Palmer.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. Thank you for those comments. Commissioner Hovland.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer, and thank you to everyone joining us today for this event. A theme that I believe we'll see across the panels today, and rightfully so, are monetary considerations for this pilot program. Election officials are often under tight operating budgets and the constraints that come with that, and investing in equipment like E-Pullbooks is not a purchase that's made lightly. As the EAC is developing this program, it's important that we balance efficiency, security, and accessibility, but we also must take into account cost considerations and factors from the perspectives of election officials as well as manufacturers. Federal baseline requirements would help standardize the way E-Pullbooks are evaluated and ensure that a certain level of security and accessibility is baked into these systems. It may also ease the burden on state election officials that may not be staffed to create cybersecurity and accessibility requirements, along with the testing and certification programs themselves. I look forward to exploring these considerations in today's discussions, and again, thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Chairman Palmer.
Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. Right now, at this point, we're going to get a presentation on the pilot program itself, where we stand, and To do that today is our Chief Information Security Officer, Jessica Bowers, and Johnny Collins, who's Director at Mandiant, and they'll provide a brief presentation on the goals of the pilot program, the timelines and the approaches as we move forward defining the security requirements of the electronic program. So with that, Jessica, are you on and available? Check to see if you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Jessica. Yes.
Okay, thanks. And are you seeing my presentation?
I think I am. Yes. Yes.
Great. Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Palmer, Vice Chair Hicks, Commissioners McCormick and Hovland for the opportunity to present a brief overview of our E-Pullbook pilot program. As the Chairman mentioned, my name is Jessica Bowers, and I'm the EAC's Chief Information Security Officer. I'm joined today by Johnny Collins, a director with Mandiant, who has extensive experience testing the security of E-Pullbooks and is working with us to develop security requirements. We'll be giving a brief overview of the pilot program and our current progress towards implementation. So I'd like to start with the definition. For the purposes of this pilot, the EAC has defined an E-Pullbook as a device that partially automates the process of checking in voters, assigning voters the correct ballot, and marking off voters who have been issued a ballot. E-Pullbooks may be used in place of traditional paper poll books, and they can be standalone at a precinct or vote center location with a local copy of the registration list, or it can be connected to a central system where they can check and update records in real time. Some quick statistics. I know the other commissioners mentioned them, but according to the data collected during our 2020 Election Administration Voting Survey, or EVES, E-Pullbooks are used in roughly 31% of jurisdictions in 38 states of jurisdictions that responded to the survey. 16 states and territories reported use of E-Pullbooks by all of their jurisdictions. 17 states used them in some jurisdictions. 12 reported that testing and certification is required by statute. 10 reported that testing and certification is required by a formal administrative rule or as guidance. And 17 reported that testing and certification was not required. The EAC plans to implement a pilot testing and certification program for E-Pullbooks that closely contours the existing voting system testing and certification program. This leverages a well-understood process and allows us to utilize existing expertise and organizational structure to determine the effectiveness of this type of program. The pilot will develop the following key elements: requirements and responsibilities for participants in the program, a way for manufacturers to register to formally participate, testing requirements and procedures, reporting and certification artifacts, and quality monitoring program. Our goal is to complete testing and/or certification of at least 2 E-Pullbook systems by the end of calendar year 2022. Sorry. Now I'll turn it over to Johnny Collins of Mandiant to describe how we've been developing security requirements.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everyone for having me on today. I really appreciate it. Just to give a little bit of context on the requirements, it's based on case studies that we've done within Mandiant with our partners, and the idea there is, things that we've seen along the way, things that can be shored up. It follows a NIST methodology. A lot of those are referenced part of the requirements. And the idea behind a lot of this is to have threat modeling of different scenarios, whether it's, the concern for insider threat, concern for supply chain compromise, or other, potential avenues. And the idea is it enumerates the best practices that we've seen across the board. A lot of great things have been implemented in E-Pullbooks, and we just wanted to keep building off of those and building those into these requirements. Next slide. So as far as the draft requirements today, they have we'll call them control families for simplistic terms, but it's very similar to what you've seen for other, frameworks. So access control, that's focused at, actual handling of the devices from a connectivity perspective, and logging in and that sort of thing. As we get into physical security, that's actually how the devices are handled and controlled from a pure physical perspective. Software security, so whether it's a software that's loaded onto commercial off the shelf, something that you just you get your standard laptop, or whether it's a custom program that's put in kiosk mode on an iPad, as an example. That's software security. Network and telecommunication security, that's all the interconnectivity, whether it's a standalone or whether it's a networked EPB. The idea there is for when it's being used for elections purposes, making sure that it's controlled so that it limits risk. Software design and architecture standards, that really gets into making sure that security is built into the software code, and also digs into as you implement the software on platforms, making sure all those things are shored up. Audit records is to have visibility across the board, whether it's a networked cloud platform or it's a standalone system where you have to manually pull the logs after the election. That's covered in that portion. And then quality assurance and configuration management, as changes are made over time, and changes will be made, right? You can't boil the ocean one day, as I like to say, but the idea here is as things are made available, as new features come out, that there's rigor put into that, and making sure that testing is included in that part. I think that's all I have, Jessica. I think it's back over to you, correct?
Thank you, Johnny. So last thing I want to cover is some next steps that the EAC is going to be taking as part of this pilot program. So moving forward, the EAC plans to utilize accessibility and usability experts, both internal and with some of our partners, to draft accessibility requirements. The EAC recognizes accessibility requirements are just as important as security. Regarding the usability requirements, we hope to use experts both internally and with our federal partners, but also election officials in states that have mature E-Poll programs in use. We plan on continuing, as we have with the security requirements, making sure these are standards-based and utilize existing relevant VVSG requirements where possible. We will draft program management documents such as a program manual, a manufacturer registration mechanism or form. And then we'd like to begin test pilots by the second quarter of 2022. And then as we move to that program, we'd like to release a report on our findings in late 2022 or early 2023. And that is it. So thank you for your time. I'll return the floor back to Chairman Palmer.
I want to thank you, Jessica, Ms. Bowers, and Mr. Collins for this work that you're doing on this. It's always heartening to have the experts working on this and you see progress. Jessica, we really do need to clone you a couple of times. Thank you for all the hard work that you're doing, and you do the work of 2 or 3 people. We really appreciate it. With that, I want to again thank you. That was a great overview of the pilot program and a good way to start today's discussion. I'm going to turn this over to Vice Chair Hicks because we have a number of panels to talk about the program. Vice Chair Hicks, will you introduce our first panel?
Thank you, Chairman. Today's first panel includes representatives from E-Pullbook manufacturers. Their thoughts on a pilot program, what is currently being done, and what the EAC should be thinking about are an important part of this discussion. Today, joining us are Tim Hallett, Vice President for Certification at ES&S, Tim Block, Director of Client Services at TX, Ben Martin, Chief Operating Officer for VR Systems, and David DeVue, President of Robust Elections, and John Metcalf, CEO and founder of VoteTech, Scott Lindeck, CEO and founder of Knowing. And I want to thank you all for participating here today. I would like to start off with the questions. How are you currently managing the large variation of state standards and requirements? And can you give us some examples? And we can start off by the order of introduction.
Sure, this is Tim Hallett. First of all, I'd like to thank the commissioners and the EAC for allowing us the opportunity to discuss this program with them. From ES&S's perspective, obviously there's a bunch of different standards out there, but a lot of them boil down to the same set of standards. So what we're doing right now is we have a baseline configuration for our Pullbook that encompasses most of the state requirements. For those specific states that require additional features and functions where our Pullbook doesn't quite align right now, or some other customers that want additional features and functions, what we do is obviously we create a gap analysis. We identify where we have gaps, and then we roll those into future releases of development. So we bring them all together, review them, get a development plan in place, and then we release them as comprehensive releases going forward.
Thank you, Timothy.
Good afternoon, and I echo the appreciation for you guys inviting all of us to be here and appreciate all of your time in this important program. Similar to what Tim said with ES&S, I think when we look at the large variations of state standards and requirements, I think we do know that there are some consistencies and similarities between many of the items that are in the states and territories across the United States, which include things like provisionals, early voting, ID required, same-day registration, just to name a few. So our system is designed to be flexible in the ability to cover these baseline items. And then from there, we really do have to kind of take a look at each state as we bring them on or they develop their standards and look at the unique variances that they have to accommodate their processes and their procedures. From there, we can then begin to kind of fold them into our certification processes that then go out to different testing labs in the different states to accommodate those. So it's a combination of the common items across the board as well as the individual items that we see within each jurisdiction.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize I was next. Thank you. I first off like to thank the commissioners and the chairman for having us here today and an opportunity for us to speak to you guys and to the public at large. I am happy to say that, as vendors, we already come together where we're trying to work as a group to protect democracy as a whole. So we have a lot of these conversations through our relationships with the Subsector Coordinating Council with the Department of Homeland. So a lot of the information that was presented by the two previous, we concur with that. I will tell you that some of the jurisdictions that we look at, the major deltas, we capture through workflows. We will identify how the product is used. As in some jurisdictions, they may allow voters to do same-day registration and actually vote on that day, vote a normal ballot. In other jurisdictions, what we will see is a voter who does a same-day registrant is put into a holding pattern until it's adjudicated by a canvassing board to determine if it's tabulated or not. Some of the jurisdictions may call that terminology a provisional type ballot. So we'll track all of those types of workflows and the deltas between the different jurisdictions or states. And then from that, we build to whatever the certification process is in each jurisdiction. So that's how we handle it.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, so similar to ES&S, we take each state into account, but the end result is a single software version that then is configurable based on the jurisdiction. So, so that we have one set of code that is reviewed by a Vistal or the states, and then we just turn things on or off based on what they need. The hardware, there's sometimes hardware configurations. So some states, no Wi-Fi is allowed, for instance, so that actually is required to be disabled at the hardware level. And other states actually require that we use the network. So those are the changes, but from a software standpoint, we look for essentially a single version that is configurable. And then what we do between the states is some of them require VISTL certificate or code review. And what we try to do is work with the states so that a single code review by SLI, for instance, or ProV&V can accommodate all of their standards. We'll actually say, hey, here's the standards from these, here's the standards from these, and we need, when you do your, so we don't have to do it twice, when you do your review, take all of those into account.
Thank you. John?
I think I've got it. Thank you to the commission for having us all here. We've in previous discussions with colleagues in the Pullbook business, we certainly have helped each other figure out what to do. To give you just brief look at, to answer your question, we have a single code base. We do just use the state parameter to tell us which paths to take through the code. There are two things probably that drive VOTEC in its design. One of those is we see Pullbooks as truly just an extension of voter registration, election management into the polling places. So it's part of that system. And in fact, most of our sales have been to our voter registration / election management customers. And we've from 2008 had a real-time connection between the poll books and the voter database. The other thing we pay strong attention to is HAVA and its requirement for uniform election administration and uniform and non-discriminatory. So our kiosk form factor is geared towards both that. Everyone sees the same thing because the voter gets a screen to see the messages on, rather than depending on the verbalization from the poll worker. And secondly, it allows for accessibility, independent check-in, which other systems do not. Other systems with a flip would always have the pressure on the voter to turn the screen back over to the poll worker rather than allowing the voter just the comfort of their own screen. Thank you.
Thank you. And Scott?
Thank you all for having me, Chairman, Vice Chair. You know, this is a great conversation to be a part of. You know, this is something that, you know, has been going on for some time with Pullbooks. Knowing's been involved with Pullbooks over the past 10 years. We've been in business for 10 years now, and this is our primary, you know, purpose is Pullbooks. We've got over 900 jurisdictions that are users, you know, out in the field. So seeing that number of 1,900 that, you know, acknowledge that they're using, 900 plus are our clients. So just this past election in November, 500 of them were out there using this, our product in the field. I think most of the panel has stolen most of my talking points for the most part with a lot of how they do things. I think we're very similar in a lot of ways. You know, some of us use different hardware, you know, here and there. On our end, kind of what David was, you know, talking about, I thought he said it great. You know, we configure to each state, you know, as we grow. Each state has its own branch. We have a tree. You know, I like to, you know, picture it as a tree with different branches for each state. Within our system, you can toggle a branch on or off. If somebody wants to, you know, do initials for a state, like in Missouri, in the state of Missouri, you're required to do 2 initials. In another state, you may only have to do 1 initial. So you could toggle that off. If you want to have a printer, you could toggle those off. The purpose of that is to make it, while it's a very sophisticated, you know, piece of software, we want to make it very simple for the end user, for the election official. I was a former election official, and that's what, you know, back in St. Louis, I always noticed when we were bringing in new voting equipment, I wanted to be very independent. So that's how we created our product to be. So everything from the start, you know, from configuring your poll pad to set it up on election day to loading your voter file, you don't send that voter file, you know, to, you know, No Ink. You set it up all yourself and do it all yourself. So that's kind of how we developed it. We want our, clients and our election officials to be very self-sufficient. We are there to support them, obviously, but ultimately we want them to do it themselves.
Thank you. Commissioner McCormick, do you have a question for this first round?
I do. Thank you, Vice Chair Hicks. This is a yes or no question for each of the panelists. I may be surprised if you say no, but this is for the record, and we can go in the same order that we went in. Do you believe this program must be agile, considering how often you release updates on these devices? And we can start with Mr. Hallett.
Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Vlock?
Yes, absolutely. We believe that it will be crucial for this program to be agile, given that most of the e-Pullbooks on the market today are COTS-based solutions. So not only is it the software that's being delivered by the Pullbook providers, but there's also the operating systems and the operating system updates that are provided by the hardware manufacturers as well that need to be considered.
Thank you. Mr. Martin?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Mr. DeVue?
Yes, and I know it's yes or no, but I just want to add the operating system. Every time that patch or build changes, which is often once a month, we want to make sure we don't have to go back to certification every time COTS touches their software.
Thank you. Mr. Metcalf?
Fine with me, although not my first priority. Did you hear me? The screen is frozen over here.
I heard you.
I'm back. Yeah, sorry. Mr. Leindecker?
Absolutely. I would agree with everybody on the panel. Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Hovland, do you have questions?
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. Along those lines, just another yes/no question, if possible, and we'll run through everybody in the same order. I'd like to get your opinion, yes or no, if you feel that security requirements should include requirements specifically related to cloud technologies. Again, Mr. Hallett, if you could start.
Yes, as long as they're reasonable in nature and consist of security best practices. And provided that manufacturers can continue to utilize the technologies that they deem appropriate for their systems.
Thank you for that, Mr. Block.
Yes, we think it's extremely the right move and fair to have a level playing field to start out with as part of this program.
Thank you, Mr. Martin.
Yes, I agree with those comments. In as much as many of the jurisdictions require near real-time or real-time updates to the Pullbooks, we are leveraging cloud. So based on that, we also recognize, because of bad actors are out there and doing their best to cause havoc where they can. One of the spaces that is a prime target for that is the cloud environment. So absolutely.
Thank you for that. Mr. DeVue.
Yes, any kind of web connection we think needs standards. I would add that we discourage anyone from using the cloud, the public cloud, commercial cloud for voter data, because it introduces another person, another entity that has access to the voter data.
Thank you for that. Mr. Metcalf.
We definitely feel the cloud configuration and usage techniques should be part of the standards.
Thank you. And Mr. Leindecker.
Commissioner Hovind, yes, we would agree with that as well. I think that's very important. The security standards are what I would think that you guys should really lead on. I think that would be very helpful, overall.
Great, thank you for that. And Chairman Palmer, I'll go back to you until the next round. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. My question is, with the frequency of testing and cost, obviously considerations, can you talk a little bit about your recommendations to the EAC and what we should consider as we develop this pilot program? Frequency of testing and the cost. Let's go from the end. Scott Leindecker, let's start off with you.
You know, I'm not understanding the question, to be honest, Chairman. Could you help me there?
So sure, with the frequency of cost and testing as considerations, can you talk a little bit about any recommendations the EAC should consider as we develop the pilot program?
You know, that's one thing, you know, we do there's a lot of certification all over the country as is already. And cost is a big factor. You know, every state has different costs associated with it. So that is, you know, obviously as you go into a different state, those costs can add up. They do a great job, I'll say, the states do. Indiana, New York, California, those are states that really have done a very outstanding job, you know, with their certifications and things like that. But costs are, you know, definitely something that would be helpful if there was some standards that you put in place and then pass those along to the state.
Okay. John Medcalf.
Main consideration I see is that you need to focus on what really needs testing to be of utility to the states, the counties, and the vendors. And that will determine the natural frequency of testing. As far as costs go, once again, if things have to be tested, the costs have to be borne. And we certainly appreciate when they can be financed by the government.
Thank you. David DeVoe.
Yeah, our concern is that the standards themselves be developed with people who actually run elections and with commercial software people. Often we find the standards are developed sort of esoterically, often by college professors. And a lot of times we find that they don't really mesh with real world deployment or with an understanding of elections data. One standards board we talked to in a state, they'd never heard of provisional ballots when we tried to talk to them about that process. So that would just be our encouragement is don't use theorists, but actual people who are in the election industry and actual commercial software developers or deployers as opposed to academicians or theorists.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Ben Martin. Hello.
Thank you, Commissioner. Actually, and I agree with the comments of my colleagues, but one of the things that we would like to see, because as we go through testing in different jurisdictions, some jurisdictions, every time there's a change, they want a complete test scenario, start to finish, the same as the initial testing. We feel like that there's a lot of waste in this process. What we would love to see is some type of evaluation of the company that is providing the software or the changes, looking at best practices, looking at how their software developers write software, how it's stored, how it's managed, how it's secured, looking at things like third-party security providers inside those networks. And then once you evaluate those, you give a type of grade to the company that's actually providing the product or service. And if the company has a higher grade, an A or a B, when they go back for changes, it's more of a minimal testing. You're looking at the change in the code. Very similar to what John Metcalf just said. I agree with that comment, but we're only testing those things once you evaluate the company is a value company and they're using best practices and security. Then you test those things that need to be tested, as opposed to every single time you go through a testing scenario, it's a multi-month process, looking at the code, testing many times for what we call happy path testing. They're really only making sure that the product works the way that it's designed to work and not doing the type of testing that will help secure us against bad actors who may be wanting to obfuscate the elections as a whole. So that's what we would like to see. And maybe the initial testing is a longer term because you're essentially grading the company. But then once they've achieved those higher level grades, you audit maybe on an infrequent or irregular basis, but that their testing for changes is a much more fast track process. But that's what we would love to see.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Mr. Vlock, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, just a real brief one. I think I echo the comments of my colleagues as well. I think a couple of things to just consider in this process is also, with the modern e-Pullbooks on the market today, again, most of them are commercially off-the-shelf hardware or COTS. So we need to have the involvement of the hardware and operating system providers as well. Because one thing that none of us can control is the hardware and operating systems as part of that. Given the global manufacturing crisis that we're facing with the pandemic, they have their own issues that they have to resolve in a quick fashion. So getting them involved in the process so we can understand what their deployments look like, what their updates look like, are also critically important in this process, as well as we've talked about the cloud-based is really kind of the modern way of hosting these, and having those providers involved to understand, their best practices, their security requirements, and what they bring to the table, because they are a critical part of the e-Pullbooks of today and tomorrow. So, having them involved in this process will be critical, as well as, again, just echoing another comment, the local and state election officials across the United States, so that we can ensure that we're covering not only the standards that are uniform across all states and territories, but the unique ones in those states and territories as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hallett.
Yeah, just a couple of additional comments. One, I think it's important that the EAC works with local jurisdictions and states to get buy-in. I think it would be extremely helpful if the EAC certifies a Pullbook, then the state could take that certification and do minimal testing. I think that would keep costs down, and maybe, obviously the states will have to do their own testing to their individual rules and regulations. But if to the extent that they can accept an EAC certified Pullbook and do minimal testing, I think that'll help keep the costs down. And then, depending on how the Pullbook pilot project shakes out, I think it's important also to note that, there could be a lot of releases, a lot of updates coming into the EAC for review. So I think the EAC needs to be aware that, similar to what they do with voting systems with de minimis changes, I think there has to be some ability for certain updates and features and functions to get through the process quickly, because it's vitally important for us to get these releases and updates to our customers in a timely manner.
Well, thank you. That was all very, very helpful and helpful to our team. I'm going to turn it back over to Vice Chair Hicks.
Thank you, Chairman. In that same vein, we're looking at how to implement a quality monitoring program in support of our testing efforts. For example, audits, spot checks, etc. Can you tell us about current support agreements you have in place with customers and how that might impact the way that we design this program, or this part of our program? We can start from the same sort of reverse order with Scott.
Yeah, absolutely, Vice Chair. I think this is a really good question, and this is something, with regards to, going through and working with, the different jurisdictions. This is always a challenge, on the support end, with regards to spot checking, LNA testing, things like that are something that I think would be extremely helpful for the EAC to help assist, and give certain guidelines, and, this is how you should go through these types of processes, because we do help, the jurisdictions. And, once again, we send checklists, we provide those types of things for them, but that's really coming from us. And while that's helpful and good, they should have some standards and some best practices and things that are passed down from what I would say the top, the EAC, saying that this is some guidelines and some help that they should go through, especially some types of LNA testing and things like that. I would think that would be very beneficial. Things that we do, like I was saying, we help them. We have constant support with all of our jurisdictions throughout the election process from the very beginning, from loading files to the very end, how you extract your files and get your voter credit and history off of those. So there's different checklists that we provide and go through. But I think the one right in the middle is the LNA that definitely needs some assistance and would be very helpful coming from the top.
Thank you. John?
So I totally agree with what Scott's saying there. The LNA needs elevating. It's what's made Pullback so successful so far. 1,900 plus jurisdictions, very few press-worthy events, and that's because people know they have to check it out ahead of time. And we of course encourage it, but I think it's common knowledge. So you'll be doing everyone a favor just to make sure that's prominent in any standards you produce.
Who is that? Is that me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I actually appreciate this question because it brings up a problem you're going to have to deal with. And that is, there are certain standards that we can control that affect us, security in the code, how the hardware is configured, things like that. But then when it gets to the customer, it's really their standards that they need to comply with. There's only so much we can do. So for instance, there's some jurisdictions where the certification requires training, but we can only offer that. The jurisdiction has to accept it or want it, and sometimes they don't. And so as you're looking at like LNA testing, we do the same thing as Scott was mentioning, that we provide standards for them, but we can't force them to do those things. So we have to be careful that the standards you set for us as the E-Pullbook vendors are things within our control. So I also agree you need standards for the whole process, but then also think, who are those responsible parties? And sometimes it's not the Pullback vendor. And something I'll add to that in terms of your quality monitoring is we don't require our customers to upgrade. They choose when they're going to upgrade. So if they have a version that they like, they're happy with, they don't want to mess with changing their operating system or whatever, we offer a new version, but we can't force them, hey, go get some new hardware or go let us upgrade your systems or whatever. So just have to sort of take that into account when monitoring that we're checking at the level when they bought it. That's the standard they met. And we've added new features that meet new standards or whatever, but we can't force that upon the jurisdiction.
Great, thank you. Ben?
Thank you, sir. I agree. This is a great question. Some really good comments from our colleagues here. I would tell you that, what I'm looking at is there is a unique problem that we're going to have to solve. And, one of my colleagues talks about a three-legged stool. This is very much like a three-legged stool. You've got the vendor, you've got the election official, and then the EAC. And together, all three of us have to work together to help improve the products. Audits and spot checks, if they're conducted by our customers, it's not a problem. If we're looking at the EAC is going to externally do those types of audits and spot checks, then because of some of our service level agreements, we'll have to agree, both the vendor and our customer, to agree to give access to that. The way I read the question, you're really interested in, what type of agreements we have in place. Our company, we license the software to our customers on an annual basis. They buy their own hardware for the most part. We have some unique jurisdictions where the hardware is leased or rented, but the software is a annual licensed product. So we continue to own the software. And with that, we have rights to be able to release it for audit and survey. But once it's in the hands of the customer, we'll also have to have them agree with it also. So that's some of the unique things that we need to figure out how we're going to move forward on, but we are definitely on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Timothy?
Really echo everything that's already been said, but I think a couple of things just to consider as part of this quality assurance program, which equally agree this is extremely important, but keeping in mind that, this is often something that's being prepared, right before election day or right before the start of early voting. So just ensuring that, if this quality assurance program is implemented, that, we have, again, the buy-in from the state and local election officials to ensure that they will actually follow through with these processes and procedures that are implemented and really aren't going to hamper or hindrance their ability to deliver But also, I mean, again, you kind of asked what impact would be on our organization or our service level agreements. We're a software as a service provider. It's a fixed rate fee per device each year. So, if there is cost associated with this to the jurisdictions, we don't really have the ability to go and negotiate contracts that are already in place. So I think we need to keep in mind that whatever is implemented, we need to provide a roadmap to get them there if there will be costs associated with it so that they can appropriately budget and, accommodate those as well.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add other than that's already been said, but I do think best practices are always good for the industry as a whole. I think it helps our customers. I think it lends credence that the EAC is providing these best practices rather than just the vendor. So I do concur with that. With respect to the monitoring program, obviously we'll have to review that in line with our support agreements and see if we have to make any changes, but we can certainly do that as we go down this path.
Great, thank you all. Commissioner McCormick, do you have a question for the second round?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Hicks. This is another yes or no question for the panel. Again, pretty much for the record. As a Pullbook vendor, do you support federal requirements and standardized testing for E-Pullbook systems? And we'll start down the line with Mr. Howlett.
Yes, we do.
Mr. Vlock.
Yes, we do as well.
Thank you. Mr. Martin.
Yes, we support it with the comment that, we have to pay attention to how it impacts the cost of the products. The current certification that you have with tabulation systems, those are big ticket items compared to electronic poll books. So, keeping in mind that we don't want to price this out of the hands of our customers, but in principle, absolutely, we support the concept.
Great comment. Thank you. Mr. DeVue.
Absolutely, yes, with just the comment I made before that the program be developed practically, not by theorists.
Thank you. Mr. Metcalf.
Yes, we do.
Thank you. And Mr. Leindecker.
Yes, we do.
Thank you. I'll pass this over back to Chairman Palmer. Thank you, everyone.
So I'm happy to go, but I think Commissioner Hovland, I think it might have been your.
Thanks for that, Chairman.
Sorry about that. Got the order.
No problem.
I'm putting my signal on before cutting you off, all right?
I actually wanted to build off Commissioner McCormick's question, so it probably works out in order. Just again, building off of that, I think we believe that if this program has the potential to create cost savings and efficiencies, lead to a more streamlined approach and adding transparency and efficiency. Assuming we're successful with that, do you all envision utilizing this program once it's available? And I'll go down the original order with Mr. Howlett starting first.
Yes, we do. I mean, obviously, if we get input from the manufacturers, election administrators, and the VISTAs, we can come up with a workable program. I absolutely.
Great, thank you, Mr. Block.
Yeah, 10X is very interested in this program and the success of it, given the drive to provide a streamlined and cost savings process. As well as one thing we really haven't discussed yet today, and I think this program really could initiate, is the streamline of the data. Data is key behind these solutions. And we really haven't mentioned it much today, but data is the inconsistency that we often see with e-Pullbooks. It changes from voter registration system to voter registration system, but even from election to election with the same voter registration system. So if this program could help that would be a huge efficiency, I think, for all parties involved. That would be something I think everyone would be on board with.
Thank you for that flag. That was useful. Mr. Martin.
Yes, we would be interested. And a lot of that is, if you take a look at some of the initiatives that have gone place so far, our company, along with Scott Leindecker, NOINC, we actually were some of the first to come forward when we were looking at creating this type of program with CISA. So, and now that this looks like this may be the way to go, we are definitely on board with that.
Great. Thank you for that, Mr. DeVue.
Absolutely. We've worked with the Department of Homeland Security in some of the states, and we love that assurance for our customers. So I think that's the main thing for us, is being able to say, yes, there's been a comprehensive review by outside party. I don't see cost savings, so I would be surprised if that happens. At least when we've been involved in the past with voting system certification, it's a very expensive process, not a cost-saving process. So I'd love to hear at some point how this will save money, because I don't see that. But I very much support the whole effort.
I think just to add to that, I mean, I think where we see it is, potentially streamlining sort of, again, one process that states may be able to build off of, but rather than, as more and more people use E-Pullbooks, as this becomes more of a focal point, having 50 states worth of certification, certainly undoubtedly creates some inefficiencies. And so I think it's our hope that again, recognizing the great work that the states have done so far, we're able to take that into account and build a baseline framework that they can build off of, and that adds to the efficiencies, if that's helpful. But to go on down the list, Mr. Metcalf.
Well, definitely want to be involved, want to take advantage of what you're putting together for many reasons. It's just going to reflect best practices around the industry. And we can always benefit from learning new ones and discussing the ones we know. We would only pull back if we saw something like the over certification that Indiana jumped into in 2013, 2014, where they, with 30 minutes in the legislature, decided that the certification should look just like it did for the voting equipment. And of course, these two functionalities are at the opposite of ends of several spectra, from privacy to the environment they work in, one being just a closed box and the other being the world, the internet. So keep them focused and we'll be very happy.
Absolutely. And I think all of our conversations have recognized that, E-Pullbooks came up within the scope of the VBSG conversation. And I think very consistently, what we've talked about is that these are very different technologies, and particularly that often necessity to connect to the internet is first and foremost in considering that, and the ability because of that to do regular patching, as we talked about earlier. But not to leave Mr. Leindecker out, would love to just, again, if we're successful in how we envision this working out, is this something that you would want to utilize?
Yes, absolutely. This is something definitely we would want to utilize. From day one, we started No Ink. This was something that we always said certification is very important in every state, to make sure that they're going and checking, every box to make sure that the product is performing exactly how it should and is intended to do. I think coming from you, would just be another great layer. I agree with you on, the cost saving aspect of helping, especially, I'm not looking at when you think about a lot of the states that, this would impact and help, the Indiana, the New York, the California, these guys do a great job. There's other states out there that could use some help, in this process, kind of like Ben had mentioned, going the happy path, or not even going a path at all, to certify or verify anything. So I think that this just helps, create some standards, put them in place so that everybody, understands what the product should do. I think over the years, the nice thing as well, all of these products have matured, over the years, and have gone through a lot of testing, everybody on the call right now has, I think overall, every vendor has done an outstanding job of helping these jurisdictions, move forward. So yes, I would be, I'm excited to participate. We're excited to be a part of the process, and whatever we can do, we want to help.
Thank you for that. Chairman Palmer, I'll give it to you now.
Thank you, Commissioner Alvin. That was a great question. I think that one of the reasons that we are looking at this program is because there's just so many states that don't have any sort of review or testing program for the Pullbooks. And so there's a lot of vendors out there that are, their security levels are just not up to speed, and the election officials need sort of that assistance from the state and from the EAC, hopefully. I have a question, but we probably don't have enough time for everybody to go through. But if someone has a few comments, please jump in. The question really is as we look at this, what process do you have in place as a manufacturer to ensure the industry best practices and modernization of technology is being implemented on your E-Pullbook? So how do you maintain that process? So that's important for us to know.
If I may, this is John Metcalf.
Thank
Just to comment on our particular approach, we use Windows and both on a laptop for the poll worker and the tablet for the voter. For the laptop, we use a product from Microsoft called Windows Long-Term Servicing Channel, and it's basically kiosk mode. And essentially, they guarantee not to update the software for somewhere between 8 and 10 years. And because we believe the Pullbook functionality has been virtually the same for the past 20 years, we're not worried about technological evolution. We just want to keep using the same thing on behalf of our customers. For the tablet, we use Microsoft Windows Home, and we essentially do not update that either. Therefore, we gain great confidence over the years in the software that we're running. That's all.
Does anybody else have a comment on that? Mr. Lindbecker?
Yeah, I have a comment, Commissioner, Chairman, I'm sorry. We actually, as many of our colleagues do also, and I'm sure they would agree, we are engaged with the Alphabet Soup of security folks. Many of us, most everybody here at the table is a member of the Subsector Coordinating Council with Department of Homeland. So we share best practices through those types of venues. We stay up with the Federal Bureau of Investigation flash releases on threat vectors that may be emerging. We also take a look each time that we have a new election coming up in one of our jurisdictions. We look for patches and updates to the operating system or the software, and we incorporate those after going through thorough testing. One of the things that we do, particularly because we do manufacture our own hardware in some of our jurisdictions, is our software is not loaded until the hardware actually arrives in the United States. So no software ever leaves the continental United States. It's all loaded here. Where our hardware is manufactured, it comes from friends to the United States. So we make sure that all of the piece parts, including the microprocessors, come from friendly jurisdictions. Now, we also have a COTS solution, and in that we don't have quite that level of control, but there are security measures that we follow for our Apple product and our Windows product that's commercial off the shelf. So we implement all of those to ensure that we're staying up with best practices. And then, the main thing is every time we do a release, we review those best practices. We review all the recommendations from the alphabet soup of security folks, and then we update and patch where appropriate.
So one thing, this is David DeVue, I just want to add is we evaluate each standard based on how that will impact elections. Because we find sometimes people look at general standards and think, oh, that's a computer, we should apply that. We had one state that recommended, they set a standard that it should be asset management, specifically solar winds on the poll books. And our response was no, that adds an attack vector to the poll book of something be able to come into the poll book from outside. So I think even though that was a standard that was a national standard, and if they wanted to apply it, I think we have to be careful that just because it's a standard or best practice doesn't mean it's applicable to elections or specifically to the protection of poll books.
Very good point. If there's anybody else who wants to get in on that question, if not, I'm going to turn it back over to Vice Chair Hicks. Okay, I think we're ready to move on, Vice Chair Hicks.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to follow up with David DeVue, separate call, I guess, because I want to make sure that I didn't mishear him with saying that the state didn't understand what a provisional ballot was, since under HAVA, all states have to deal with provisional ballots for federal elections. But I can follow up later on with that. But again, I want to thank you all for being here today. And if there's additional questions, we would like to send those via written to you. But right now, I want to turn this over to Commissioner McCormick to introduce our second panel.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Hicks. And thank you to all our panelists for that interesting conversation. I appreciate your enthusiasm for this idea. So and moving on, as the EAC develops this pilot program, another consideration is the role of the laboratories doing the testing. Both laboratories joining us today also test voting systems for EAC certification. On this panel, we have Jesse Peterson, who's the Voting Security Test Specialist for SLI, and Jack Cobb, Laboratory Director of ProVNV. So thank you both for joining us. I appreciate you being here, and I will start off the questioning. I have a multi-part question, so I'll give you the first part and then we'll come back for the second part. How does the testing of e-Pullbooks vary from voting systems, and what standards do you use to test e-Pullbooks, and where do they come from? And we'll start with Mr. Peterson.
Thank you. Real quick, I just wanted to thank the Vice Chair and the Chairman and the Commissioners for allowing SLI a chance to do this. And basically, the testing of e-Pullbooks varies much in the fact that an e-Pullbook basically provides a poll worker access to a roster of eligible voters using a tablet or a laptop computer, potentially even some scanning devices or a QR code reader. And it generally interfaces with voter registration data. Whereas a voting system has much more functionality with hardware and software components. A voting system for the VVSG must provide the ability to define elections and ballot styles, record votes and count tallies, and generate audit logs and election results. All of this makes testing of a voting system much more involved and requires a greater amount of time. The key element that's different between an e-Pullbook and a voting system is that e-Pullbooks in some cases require access to the internet or wireless networks, which raises additional risk from increased attack vectors, including attacks that target wireless systems, internet-connected devices, and the potential for DDoS attacks, and in some cases, physical devices that are more easily stolen or lost. All of these examples are avenues of which attack, which can require more security and telecommunication testing focuses. Do you want me to answer the second part of your question now, or do you want to flip back to that?
We can come back to that. Let's go to Mr. Cobb. Hi, Jack.
Yes. Hi, how are you doing, Commissioner? Thank you, all the commissioners and the chairman and vice chair for having us on today. The standards that we test to are generated by the state. ProVNV specifically has helped several states develop electronic poll book certifications, but the Commonwealth of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, they're all different, and there's California and New York, they're all different, and whichever state that a manufacturer is choosing to go into, that's what we do the testing towards.
Okay, well, I mean, my second question kind of, follows from that. What is tested currently, like in terms of things like security, interoperability, usability? Is it different among the states, or are you testing for all of those things? We can start with Mr. Cobb and then go to Mr. Peterson.
Yeah, so encryption's being tested, telecommunications is being tested. Some of the states vary widely. Some of them don't even allow communications outside of a polling location. But yeah, we are looking at, is the data that's being transmitted encrypted? If they use a VPN, do we look at the VPN? Yes, we do. We look at the telecommunications arc, I guess, the whole network of how are you going to go through this? Some states don't require, there's if you drew out the architecture, there's just a cloud in the middle where they're getting the service from someone else, AT&T or Verizon or somebody like that. But all that stuff is looked at, but it varies very much from state to state.
Okay, Mr. Peterson, do you have anything to follow on that?
Oh yeah, so I mean, our testing usually encompasses kind of a whole gamut of things. basic functional testing, such as, determining whether or not the E-Pullbook can import or export data from the registration system or the database. Whether or not the device, produces audit logs, whether or not it's capable of identifying whether or not the voter has the correct polling location. It also includes verifying the process for checking in a voter. So those are all kind of your basic functional stuff that we test. We also, depending obviously, like Jack said, on what jurisdiction we're testing for, there's also source code review components, which goes along with security testing. That's like Jack said, we're testing for encryption and that type of stuff. We also do a lot of architecture and design documentation examination.
So would you agree that what you're testing really truly is just varies wildly from state to state?
Oh yes, for sure. I mean, each one of the states that we test in currently have their own E-Pullbook requirements. I mean, there isn't a federally certified program at this point. So yeah, we're just kind of going by what the states want in each of these cases.
Thank you. Commissioner Hovland, do you have questions for this panel?
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. And sort of to build off that variety that we see across the states, I'd like for each of you to talk a little bit about, how long it currently takes to test an E-Pullbook. Obviously, with that variety that you were just talking about, I'm sure that's going to make a difference. So I don't know if each of you want to take a couple minutes and just sort of talk about what you generally see and maybe some of those pieces that you mentioned before or others that maybe add time or what that looks like from a testing standpoint. Mr. Cobb, if you wanted to start.
Sure. It's already been stated there's a wide variety, and that wide variety comes with a cost and a time to test for each one, and it is across the board. I mean, California takes a lot longer and is a lot more expensive than the Commonwealth of Virginia. And some of the programs were put in place specifically to reduce time and reduce cost. But in Virginia, it could take us 1 week to do a Pullbook, whereas I think Jesse can speak more too, but in California, it can take a month or two. And those two time periods come with very differing costs.
Mr. Peterson, would you want to add to that?
Jack pretty much hit the nail on the head. Currently right now, the E-Pullbook engagements that we've been involved with take anywhere from a week to a month. The more complicated requirements of California, for example, definitely take longer. If we had a clear, concise path forward, then maybe that would help.
Useful, thank you. Chairman Palmer.
Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. So my question, what's the biggest challenges in testing security and accessibility of E-Pullbooks that you see? We'll start with Mr. Peterson.
Unlike voting machines, a lot of the E-Pullbooks are connected to networks that are potentially public, whether it's a wireless network or the internet to hit the voter registration database. That's probably one of the big things for the cloud storage. In addition, many of the E-Pullbook devices consist of a mobile computing platform, such as an Android or an Apple tablet, which greatly increase potential attack vectors and extend the efforts to secure the test device. The biggest challenge, I think, is protecting these type of devices in a connected environment that's using wireless. This includes ensuring that the devices are properly patched and protected. Targeted exploitation of connected E-Pullbooks and other internet-connected election infrastructure services by threats is a serious concern. Let's see what else.
That's very helpful. Mr. Cobb?
Yes. So if I understand the question correctly, you were talking about accessibility. And one of the major challenges for the varying in the states is that the requirements for accessibility vary widely. And I would even venture to say they're not really well defined in any of the states. Some of them are, it has to be usable or things of that nature, but they're not really well defined in any one state.
That's very helpful. Well, thank you both for that. I'm going to turn it back to, let me see who's next. I think that would be Vice Chair Hicks.
Thank you, Chairman. What consideration should the EAC be thinking about at this point for development of the pilot program? Mr. Cobb, you want to start?
Sure. If I had advice on how to get started or what the EAC should try to cover, it would be to try to combine as many of the state's common standards that are already out there and kind of build to them and maybe put options in them, but try to incorporate as many as you can. I know we had a test campaign many years ago. This is when the certifications were just coming out. And about 5 or 6 states, one of the manufacturers wanted to go to like 5 or 6 different states with this one version. And we literally had to go and pull and run different testing, write different reports and all of these things because they wanted to go to 6 states. And if you could have taken all of those requirements that were common and just say, these are what will get you into Connecticut and New Hampshire and all these other places, and this is the core, then we could release to the state, sort of like in the voting system world, where there's a certification for use in the state. So the state then can look at things that are specific to the state, but the core stuff has been handled by going through the federal program.
Peterson?
Yeah, I believe the EAC should keep in mind the importance of system level and security documentation for the E-Pullbook itself. In some cases, the documentation for some of the E-Pullbook systems could use a little bit of guidance around what it needs for a certification effort. Another potential consideration would be the qualifications for the individuals conducting the security and telecommunications testing. And then as a final one, some kind of strength and understanding of the cloud hosting platforms such as Azure, AWS, and other of the MDM solutions to understand that they're being properly implemented and used in these type of solutions would go a long way to helping this program.
That's very helpful, and I want to thank you both for being here. Commissioner McCormick?
Thank you, Vice Chair Hicks. What adjustments to staff and facilities would you need to make for a federal E-Pullbook testing program? Mr. Cobb.
We wouldn't really have to make any adjustments. We currently have a dedicated resource. That's his first priority, and he rolls into other testing campaigns in voting systems when he's not working on E-Pullbooks. But just in the last 3 years alone, we've done something in the neighborhood of 76 different electronic poll books for 12 or 13 manufacturers for 12 or 13 different states. So there wouldn't be a whole lot that we would have to do because we're currently doing a lot of poll book testing.
Okay, Mr. Peterson.
SLA compliance already has a pretty significant experience testing many of the different E-Poll books, and like Jack said, all of our expertise is already in place. We've been doing it for years. We're ready to have kind of a solidified way to do it for everybody.
Great. Thank you both for answering that. Commissioner Hovland.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. Noting that you all just, you both talked about how, you're already doing a significant amount of this testing for the states. And again, you're both accredited voting system test laboratories. Do you anticipate any other or any issues, getting accredited or being able to help support this program? And if so, how long do you think it would take to get up to speed? Mr. Peterson, if you want to start.
we don't currently anticipate any issues with being accredited by the EAC to test the E-Pullbooks. Obviously, there would be some time required to make sure that we're doing all the paperwork, dotting all the I's, crossing all the T's, but I don't foresee any real issues with getting certified to do that. We've already been doing the state jurisdictions for quite a while now. We'll just be kind of shifting gears, if you will.
Great. And Mr. Cobb?
Yes. So if the EAC wants to come up with an accreditation for this program, the two labs currently have the National Institute of Standard Technology accreditations, and it could very easily just fall into line with the 1702 requirements that we have to have a standard to test to, and that the EAC has that standard or the state has that standard. It really doesn't matter, but you can roll all this into the more generic NIST accreditation, and we are already accredited.
Excellent. Thank you. Chairman Palmer.
Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. So my question is should the commission be or adopt a policy for to the laboratories in the EAC on updates and following security and accessibility standards? And would you be in favor of that type of flexibility and self-auditing by the manufacturer? Mr. Cobb, let's start with you.
Well, the self-reporting, that we could work some self-reporting in, or for like minor changes and things, but for like a full brand new version that comes out of an electronic poll book, and it's my opinion that they should have to go through the full laboratory testing that we currently do. If there's a minor change somewhere and it's already deployed, we can review that. I kind of look at it more of the self-reporting stuff for like ECOs in the voting system world. When there's just something very minor, they're de minimis, or this really is not going to have an effect that we added a second signature page for a second poll worker. It's the same page, we're just going to call it twice. That's not a big deal. So I think there could be some self-reporting parts to this, but as for a complete new system, I really think they need to go through the laboratories.
Mr. Peterson, what are your thoughts on the self-reporting as part of it?
SLA compliance definitely believes that self-reporting, self-auditing may very well be a valuable tool to expedite the process in certain types of areas, similar to what Jack is saying. We also believe that there should always be a policy or a practice to validate the self-reporting, the attestations, or any type of auditing that allows the EAC and the testing labs to validate there has been true progress or work around whatever it is that they're reporting to or self-auditing to. The big thing for us is we believe that there's some kind of middle ground that allows for the flexibility that these initiatives would bring, but also ensures that the security and the accessibility and the rest of the functionality basically are maintained.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Vice Chair Hicks, back to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. This is basically a yes or no question, or just a short answer question, and it's more so for the record. Do you feel E-Pullbooks should be tested given the threat landscape of today? And if yes, why? Mr. Peterson, do you want to start?
Oh yeah, I mean, in today's election infrastructure sector, there are many components of the election process that are often kind of glanced over in favor of the more public-facing voting systems, E-Pullbooks and some of the other connected systems out there. A lot of times aren't really looked over when it comes to requirements. A lot of these are connected. They're prime targets for APTs. They're basically in the targets of other criminals or dissidents that want to prevent us from voting. So the manipulation of the voter registration information possesses a valid real threat. Attacks on this technology could include everything from sending the voter to the wrong polling place, potentially providing the voter the wrong ballot. As such, the system provides the voter and election worker a valid tool for efficiently processing voters during an election cycle. So I believe that we should, without a doubt, provide a structured certification system that helps the jurisdictions understand the threat to their election cycles and help protect them.
Yes, and I agree with him also. The threat landscape that's out there currently, I mean, the two main functions of an E-Pullbook is to have all the voters who are eligible to vote in that poll book, and then also to issue credit that the voter was checked in and possibly finished the voting process, but at least checked in and had been issued a ballot. So those two things, if you just look at those two and you start thinking about, I can add an extra 300 or 400 people to that polling location, or I can remove 300 or 400 people who are eligible to vote. Just those two threats alone are worth looking at.
Thank you. Commissioner McCormick?
Yes, do any of the commissioners have any further questions? No. Do either of our
Commissioner Palmer?
panelists? Yes, go ahead, Commissioner or Chairman Palmer.
Well, I think I sort of know the answer to it. I really appreciated your answers to that question. I think that, like with voting systems, real or perceived attacks on our voting systems can threaten voter confidence. And I think the real potential for threats against the electronic poll books, if successful or not, could cause a hit to voter confidence. And so that's one reason we think that as much testing as possible is a good thing. But any comments on that, on the voter confidence part of it?
I would just say I concur completely.
Same. I mean, in our industry, perception is everything. The more transparent we can be, the better that the folks that are voting out there can see that we're trying to protect democracy this way. The better off we are. So I totally agree 100%.
Well, great ending comment for this panel. We want to thank both of you for being with us. I will turn this over to Commissioner Hovland now to introduce our last panel of this hearing.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. Our final panel today includes a very important stakeholders in this process. Of course, election officials. As with most things in elections, rules, processes, and procedures vary by state. We've heard a lot about that today, and the use and testing of E-Pullbooks is no different. And of course, we've talked about that, but want to hear about it from election officials themselves. Today, we've got a great group of election officials from a range of state and local offices who can talk about the nuances in their communities and their thoughts on the pilot program. I'd like to introduce Secretary Veronica DeGraffenreid, the acting secretary from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Secretary. Thank you for being here. Tom Conley, who's the Director of Election Operations for the New York State Board of Elections. Welcome. Sherry Poland is the Director of Elections from Hamilton County, Ohio, home of Skyline Chili, for those of you. And Joseph Kirk is the election supervisor from Bartow County, Georgia. So welcome to you all and thank you for being here. Just to kick it off and to give folks who are watching a little bit of an understanding and overview, can you talk about in your states or in your jurisdiction how you test and certify E-Pullbooks or how the state does for the local jurisdictions? And we'll go in the order of introduction. Secretary, if you want to kick us off.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you all for having me today. It's good seeing you guys, definitely. I'm gonna, certainly I'm the acting secretary of the Commonwealth here in Pennsylvania, but my experience with E-Pullbooks is in 2 states. Formerly, I was the director of election operations in North Carolina. So in both states, I think a good summary of what we do is a lot of making sure as much as possible with our limited resources that the E-Pullbook certainly meets some security standards, but also that it meets the functional requirements. So I don't know if I would call it a certification program, certainly not here in Pennsylvania. It's more so of an approval process. Certainly in North Carolina, there's some statutory provisions that suggest that the state is the entity that sets like the requirements or the mandates for poll books. And so to the extent that electronic poll books are used, certainly that state has a little bit more, I guess, authority to kind of ensure that any poll book used by E-Pullbook used by the county jurisdictions meets certain requirements mandated by that state. In Pennsylvania, again, it's more of an approval process. There's some respect to making sure that some security standards are met, but a lot of functionality and just making sure that before a county uses some type of E-Pullbook solution, that it also will work with the state. There's a practical need to work with the state's voter registration and election management system. So that's a quick summary. And I should also say in North Carolina, the state itself develops its own E-Pullbook and must be used by all of the 100 counties for purposes of early voting, but provides at no charge, at least in terms of the software, counties to use for purposes of election day. And I'm not sure what they're doing right now, but I think VR Systems is part of this panel. When I left North Carolina, that was the only poll book that was approved for use in North Carolina at that time.
Well, thank you for that, Secretary, and we welcome and encourage you to share your multi-state expertise with us. So thank you. Mr. Conley, tell us a little bit about New York.
Sure, and I'd like to thank you all. I'm, again, echoing what Veronica said, it's nice to see all of you again. Here in New York, a lot of the same things that Veronica described about her experience in some of her other states. We enacted early voting back in 2019, and as part of that legislation, the legislature asked the state board to come up with requirements around E-Pullbooks, not just the E-Pullbooks themselves, but also the networks that they're connected to. Similar distinction, like what Veronica raised, is we don't have a certification process per se in New York State, but rather we do have an approval process. We had looked at what was out there in the wild as far as requirements went for electronic poll books. We kind of put them all in a big spreadsheet, sat in a room for an hour or two, and went through each and every one of them to see which one we thought was a good idea for New York, and then added a bunch of our own. We pulled in some of our stakeholders as far as technology consultants. We also certainly gave some of the vendors that had expressed interest in getting into the state the opportunity to take a look at it, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't setting the bar too high, but obviously we wanted to make sure that we were making the quality of the product high. And so we ended up with about 150 mandatory requirements, 70 functional, that largely kind of followed what a poll book itself needs to do under law, and then another 80 that really focused on the security of the devices. We originally had 5 vendors that came into New York State to be evaluated. 3 of them ended up being approved for use in New York State. All 3 are used in New York State. Every county, with the exception of 1, is using E-Pullbook. And basically, we found that going forward, we do have a process in place for kind of evaluating any kind of changes to their systems, whether it be their application or the underlying operating system. And then lastly, I would just say, as I mentioned initially, the legislation that gave us this job also asked us to look at the networks involved. And so we do have a process in place with all of our localities to ensure that the networks that they're standing up for either early voting or on election day meet a certain set of requirements before the electronic poll books can connect to them.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Just as a curiosity, any chance, not to call them out, but is your outlier county Hamilton County?
It is small but beautiful.
Successful guess. Thank you. Ms. Poland, welcome. Thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit more about Hamilton County, Ohio, for those not familiar, and how you've been working with E-Pullbooks there, and what happens at the state level in Ohio?
Sure. Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you for having me. I appreciate being part of the discussion today. Hamilton County, Ohio is the home of Cincinnati and Skyline Chili, as you mentioned before. And Hamilton County is the third largest county in the state of Ohio, and we were the first to introduce today's E-Pullbook technology back in 2015. In the state of Ohio, any E-Pullbook that's used must be approved by the State Board of Voting Machine Examiners and certified by the Ohio Secretary of State. This approval and certification is conducted in accordance with state law and standards that are adopted by the State Board of Voting Machine Examiners. Each Pullbook must undergo independent testing by an authority recognized by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Our testing, or once the testing is completed, then the vendor may submit an application package to the Bureau or the Board of Voting Machine Examiners. The board then reviews the results of the testing lab and examines the functionality of the E-Pullbooks. And if they are satisfied with those results, they will recommend certification to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's office then notices all of the local boards of elections of the E-Pullbook systems that are certified for use in the state.
Great, thank you very much. And Mr. Kirk, can you tell us a little bit about Bartow County, Georgia, and again, how you interact with E-Pullbooks there and at the state level?
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Bartow County is about an hour north of Atlanta. Has about 70,000 voters, population over 100,000, so we're not the biggest. We use Pullbooks since the mid-2000s. The thing that's a little bit different about Georgia is we have a statewide voting solution for all county and federal elections, county, state, and federal elections. So rather than having a full certification program that different companies participate in, we really only certify one piece of equipment for the state, or the Secretary of State is. And I should say I'm not involved in that process here at the county level. My understanding is when we got our new Pullbooks, when we got our new voting system 2 years ago, the Secretary of State's office sat down with our testing lab, developed a list of criteria, both functional and security concerns from the test. And that's what created our certification test. And something to point out there is that they did that because there's no federal standard to test against. So it went well, and we've successfully used our Pullbooks. And then, of course, on the county level, we perform a functional test before every election. It was mentioned before, LNA testing, make sure the equipment operates properly, download the information the way it needed to, and there's not going to be any surprises on election day.
Great, thank you for that. Chairman Palmer.
Sure, thank you, Commissioner Hovell, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk. My question is a little bit directed at the state officials, I think, but if the locality, if the administrators from the localities have a couple of points, please chime in. Really, each of you talked about a program, and what were the major challenges that you faced in developing that program? You talked a little bit about each of your programs in your comments. What were those challenges, and what changes have you made to that program since the beginning? Let's start with you, Tom.
Okay, fine. Well, I would say that, I think largely our requirements haven't changed much since we put them together. Granted, they're not terribly old. Obviously, we would be open to doing so if we felt there was a need for it. With regard to the testing, when we first stood up the program, we didn't necessarily have the resources or the tools that may have been needed to kind of really do proper testing here in-house. Luckily, we were able to utilize some other state agencies. Our Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services was able to kind of help us out in doing some vulnerability testing on the devices and on the cloud-based portals. What we did was to try to slowly, since the inception of the program over the past couple of years, bring a lot of that in-house. We've brought in some of the people and the resources and the tools. We've been leveraging some of our own IT assets so that we can be a little bit more quick to turn around the testing. The challenge is also, I think, just generally speaking, is trying to be nimble. I know there was discussion earlier on in the panel about being agile, and there was also discussion about handling de minimis changes, because obviously you have underlying operating systems, especially for certain COPS products that don't necessarily align their calendars with ours. And so, when you have, let's say, Apple, for example, had a major release back in September, less than 45 days before the November general election, that can sometimes cause a little bit of a problem for us when we're trying to ensure that the configurations that we're approving for use in the state are the latest and greatest, or at least have some of those security issues that might have been the reason for an iOS update still mitigated in some way.
Hey, Tom. Madam Secretary, what were some of your challenges?
Right, thanks. So understand, I guess, that North Carolina's E-Pullbook use that was developed at the state was 2007, 2008 timeframe. And so when you look at, that starting time for that state and then going into 2016, a lot changed. So I would say that a lot of my experience has been, not understanding what you really don't know and what you should know, and now understanding that elections is critical infrastructure. So in North Carolina, we had to strengthen our standards, I guess, for security, and it was a practical approach as well. Like, we didn't fully understand or appreciate that, how the counties in that state configured or set up their E-Pullbook. And when we figured out what was happening, we certainly worked with, we understood, from the standpoint of how it worked with the state system, but used the third party. We had to work with the vendor and work with the counties to, change those standards a little bit to make sure that the setup of the E-Pullbook could be done in a more secure manner. So the challenge has been, just making sure that you're mindful of those things that need to be considered, that are out in the field, that are not in a laboratory, type of setting. Like, what are the practical implications as to how a county is going to accomplish even setting up an E-Pullbook? So I would say that was one of the early challenges that I think we experienced back in 2016 and beyond. I would also say that from a practical standpoint, in both states, there are also challenges because of the need for the E-Pullbooks, once again, to work seamlessly with the state's voter registration database system, output and input. And so going into conversations about the agile world and being flexible, when you work in a state that is subject to legislative changes or to sometimes litigation, things can change with respect to the certainly the administration of elections. That absolutely can affect, how the E-Pullbook is supposed to function or what a form looks like. And so also understanding that in our industry with elections administration, we have very finite timelines that we have to conduct an election, and sometimes finding that period of time when you can make a change to the system. And when you, like in Pennsylvania right now, there's several vendors who have approved E-Pullbook solutions. So, we have to be very mindful that as we work with our counties to make changes to the state's voter registration database system and election management system, at the same time, we have to make sure that they too are working with their third-party vendor, that we're working with them and sharing information. So communication, I think that's true in anything that we do in life, is so vital. And if you don't properly communicate, that absolutely will lead to challenges.
That's very helpful. It was pretty directed at the states, but Mr. Kirk and Ms. Poland, do you have any comments on sort of the challenges you saw in your respective states over the years?
I do not. Thank you.
I just want to say that I echo the comments made by both Secretary DeGraff and Reed and Director Conley. We struggle with the timing of when certain updates occur. Absolutely. I know exactly the Apple update you're referring to in September stands out in my mind as well. So yeah, I just definitely echo their comments.
Thank you, Sherry. Tom, I'm going to hand it to you for any questions that you have. Tom, are you available?
Vice Chair Hicks may be frozen.
Yeah, I think
see
he's
that I'm
frozen.
but I don't know if you can still hear me.
We can.
I can hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
well, I can read the question then. What are some of the benefits with E-Pullbook testing and certification program? And have you seen usage and functionality of the E-Pullbooks change over time? And I guess that's directed at all four of you, but we can start from Mr. Kirk and go in reverse order this time.
Thank you very much. In my opinion, the main benefit of these testing and certification programs is to minimize surprises for us folks on the ground on election day, to make sure they meet a minimum level of security, accessibility, usability requirements. And then the other thing that I think about is at each step in the process, starting from the manufacturer through the state down to the counties, the poll workers, you're dealing with less skilled individuals that don't understand the threats in front of them, and making sure that the testing process ensures that they have a smooth experience at the end of the process, and a safe experience is key. As far as seeing the usage change over time, it's an interesting question. When I started thinking about it, I sort of started thinking about it in terms of phones. Back when I started using E-Pullbooks, it was like using an old flip phone. They turned on, they performed one function, that's all they did. You turned them back off, that was it. Now we have smart devices that can do so many things, but it's more vectors for attack. It's more things that can go wrong. It's more, the Pullback I use can be configured in different settings for different uses for different states, which is great. But testing the settings we're going to use and the way we're going to use them to make sure, again, that I'm having surprises on election day is really important to me. Thank
you.
Yes. Well, as a local election official, one of the benefits of having the E-Pullbook testing and certification program at the state level is that really takes a heavy lift off of the local election officials. So very appreciative that the state, and just as Director Kirk had mentioned, that I think they have a level of expertise that's greatest at the state level. I agree. And then a little lower in the local level, all the way down then to the poll workers who use them on a regular basis. And then that allows the local election officials, by having the state handle that initial certification and testing, it allows the local election officials to focus on testing before every election cycle, right? So we test these E-Pullbooks the same way we test our voting equipment prior to every election cycle. So that allows us to focus on that each election cycle. Yes, we've seen many changes with the usage of E-Pullbooks since we first implemented in 2015, right? The main focus was to check the voters in, and the E-Pullbook has tremendous benefit, right? It's cut the check-in time for voters down to half the time it did in the paper poll books, which reduces wait time for voters. We have seen the number of provisional ballots issued in Hamilton County decrease since we've implemented E-Pullbooks, because poll workers are more easily able to identify the voter and get the voter to the correct polling place. And then of the number of provisional ballots issued, the number of accepted has drastically increased. Again, because the poll workers are more easily able to identify the correct voter and get the correct ballot to the voter. But now we use E-Pullbooks for so much more than just checking in voters. It's a way for us to track live voter turnout throughout the day by polling place on election day. We are a paper-based system in Hamilton County, so we use it to track our ballot inventory throughout the day, which is critically important that we do not run out of ballots at the polling places. We use it to track the number of provisional ballots, the number of soiled and defaced that are occurring in each polling place, because if we see that a certain polling location is having a high number of provisional ballots, an unusual number, we can immediately communicate with that poll worker, send a troubleshooter out to make sure they're following the proper procedures. So it's a great tracking tool. Also, we use it to be able to provide voters with turn-by-turn driving directions to their correct polling place if they show up at the wrong one. And it's a way we can communicate and a mass communication to poll workers on election day. When things maybe suddenly happen, even if it's a court is ordered to keep the polls open later, or something as simple as don't forget to print your 11 a.m. Voter list that's required under Ohio law at 11 a.m. We can push those messages out to the poll workers, and so we can reach them quickly and communicate the same message to make sure it's a consistent message. We even use it to track poll worker attendance and poll worker payroll, which is help to automate that system. So yes, I think E-Pullbooks, their functionality has increased drastically since their original implementation.
Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I would like to certainly echo, what Director Colin said about the benefits of the E-Pullbooks. I think with regard to the benefits of our testing program, similar to what she had said about being able to kind of take that burden off of the locals has certainly been good for us. To kind of make it all one-stop shop for evaluating these poll books. Going back to something that Secretary DeGrasse Reed had said about, obviously election changes, we're in a moving landscape. Here in New York, we've tried to formalize the process. So obviously we have, elections every year, and we have our June primary and our November general. And we've kind of worked with the 3 vendors that are approved to know that there's a given timeline, a life cycle for any kind of update. So, if they want to make changes to their system, they have to provide them to us within 90 days of an election. And then we promise that within 45 days of an election, we'll give them a yes or a no on their system. This way that we believe that we have enough time to properly evaluate it, and the vendors then have enough time to go out and update all of their different customer systems. I think it also allows us to kind of, we do have an ongoing process with them whenever there's any kind of security updates or notifications that we receive. If we believe it's applicable to a given system, we'll ask the vendor to provide us with feedback. We've also tried to create a little bit of a feedback loop with the local jurisdictions to provide us with any kind of wish list items they want. And being that we kind of run that here at the state, the whole approval process, we can pass on those wish lists to the vendors, and we give all of their requests equal voice. So you could have a small county of 15,000 voters, their voice is heard just as well as New York City's millions of voters. So we found that it's been an added benefit in that way, and doing that kind of regular process where we're constantly looking at the systems to see where can we update them, either to make them better or to make them more adherent to the law, has been really beneficial for us.
Thank you, Secretary DeGrasse Reed.
Certainly. I think I heard Mr. Kirk say he does not like surprises. I don't like surprises either. Surprises are bad, and we try to be very proactive so that we don't have those little surprises. And when we do, that there are processes in place so that we can have, continuity of operations and elections administration, because we want people to vote and get the right ballot. So I say that because then I think about, Ms. Pollin's comments and Director Connolly's comments about increase in functionality. And with that functionality comes a lot of logic about making sure that poll workers are making the best possible decision with respect to the issuance or not to issue a ballot, and what type of ballot should be issued to voters. And so understanding that poll workers do not, they only do their work a couple of times each year. They may get up, 3 or 4 hours, sometimes less, of training. I know that local jurisdictions provide poll workers just in time checklists and manuals, but there are a lot of nuances that could happen on election day or at voting sites. And we always want poll workers to make, the best possible decision. So why do we test? What are the benefits of testing E-Pullbooks? Well, it goes back to what I've said. Testing and certification or approval helps to ensure that electronic poll books are definitely secure, but they also meet the functional and statutory requirements of the jurisdiction. So it's so important to just go through every single thing, every scenario, and just make sure that vendors, when they're, especially, if they're a third-party vendor, certainly, that they are meeting the requirements of the state and the jurisdiction. I have experience, sometimes with, counties and vendors working together, absolutely trying to do the best thing, trying to make sure that, ease of use is important. We don't want things to be too complicated for poll workers, but sometimes making it, simplifying it too much may inadvertently compromise something that's required by law. So having the state come in and evaluate an E-Pullbook solution is important because it helps, that checks and balance of just making sure that any type of functionality, however innocent, meets the requirements of, the law, of regulations, and of policy in the state.
Great, thank you. Commissioner McCormick.
Thank you. I would like to ask all of you, and maybe you each have whether you're a county or state official, have a little bit of a different view, but are there procedures or functionality related to E-Pullbooks that your state does not currently certify that you think should be tested? And we could start with you, Secretary DeGraff-Reed.
Right. Well, so I think, thank you. And good to talk to you, Commissioner. So this may be an important one for like the work that you guys may be doing, considering that you are, you're in the project that you do certify voting systems. So one of the components of, electronic poll books now is that they generate the little ballot activation cards, or the little pieces of paper that you can get that the poll worker can take to a machine to bring up the ballot, right, as part of a voting system. So not only are E-Pullbooks, do they need to work with the state's voter registration database system, a state has, a statewide system, but they're also now working with, directly with the voting equipment. So there's a level of, 3 chances of just making sure that everything goes accordingly. So I know that, in this panel, we've spoken a lot about functionality, and that may not be something that perhaps in terms of a base system that will be easy for vendors, E-Pullbook vendors to test for, but certainly being part of the initial testing of making sure that if a E-Pullbook solution is supposed to work with a specific type of voting system, absolutely, that may be something that would be very helpful for the EAC or one of the VISTLs to help with. And that way, the state working with the vendor could just concentrate on the very specific things that are required in that specific jurisdiction.
Director Connolly.
Thank you, Commissioner. So, as far as functionality or things that we're not necessarily looking at, obviously there is, like Secretary DeGraff-Reed was saying, certain functionality beyond the poll book Even though, on-demand ballot printers are used quite frequently here in New York State, we do not necessarily have requirements around their use, but we obviously have some here and we use them when we're doing our testing. The other thing I would say that we're not really looking at is, I know Director Poland had mentioned some of the benefits of E-Pullbooks, and I think that we try to focus on the real core functional requirements. What is I don't want to say the minimum, but what is the legal law require that a machine do, a device do, and then anything beyond that is kind of sprinkles on the cupcake. And so if they want to have messaging capabilities or tracking capabilities, that's great. And I do know that there are certainly counties here in New York that utilize that functionality, but there are also smaller jurisdictions which may just not have the time. It would be great and all, but they just want to get through election day. So we don't necessarily look at that type of functionality when we're doing our review. I think that's all I would have to add on to it.
Okay. Director Poland, do you have something that you would like to add?
Really, just to add on to Director Conley's comments, I think that's pretty accurate in Ohio too, where I think at the state level certification, they don't always look to the sort of extras that have been added on recently, as far as poll worker payroll functionality, ballot inventory tracking. Those are sort of the extras that have been added on, and I don't think those are part of the state certification, which leaves it up to the individual counties to ensure to do all that testing and ensure that that functionality is working properly.
Are those things you'd like to see in a program?
I would like to see it as long as it doesn't slow down the certification process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good comment. Supervisor Kirk, do you have anything to add to that?
Not much. To my knowledge, Georgia tests all the functionalities that we use in the state. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of having a statewide program is they know exactly what we're going to be using and what they need to test. I do think it's important to test any part of the system of the Pullback that integrates with a voting system, or with anything that has to do with personal identifiable information or VR system. Anything that has a security concern should be part of the program.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. I'm going to pass this to Commissioner Hovland for his question.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. One nice thing about doing a pilot program is that you have a certain amount of flexibility. I certainly always think that one of the real sweet spots for EAC involvement, as you all know, we're largely non-regulatory, but those areas that impact 50 states or close to it, and where we can find those efficiencies. I think we regularly see that in accessibility. I think we see it in our voting system testing program. And I think e-Pullbooks, fall into a category that could make sense as well. But again, luckily we're doing this pilot, and that gives us some flexibility to think about, what this should look like. And so, I'd love to hear your perspectives on what, an ideal federal testing program would look like from your perspective. Secretary, we'll start with you. You were muted. Yeah. Secretary, sorry, you were on mute.
Very sorry about that. So an ideal federal testing program would absolutely look at security standards, the system's interoperability with a relevant voting system, just general ease of use, and certainly accessibility standards. And something that we haven't, I believe, discussed on this panel, but the ability to audit, so auditing protocols. I think just those core processes would go a long way to ensuring that, the base system of any Pullback solution is ready for use at the base level, and then allow the state or the jurisdiction, local jurisdiction, work with the vendor on, again, those things that are very specific to that jurisdiction.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Mr. Conley, would you add to that?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I would say that obviously it's important that any kind of testing program be thorough. But at the same time, I think what was discussed earlier with some of the vendors, is that there's definitely a need for it to be agile and relatively quick to respond to these changes that we've all been discussing. I think that obviously anything that gets in the way, like Director Poland was saying, if it slows down a process, it's not necessarily helpful to us. But what I think, you know, if it could accomplish that, and especially if it could kind of help us with some of those last minute underlying, let's say, operating system changes, or it might be de minimis changes from a vendor, where someone can really kind of quickly evaluate that helps us, because we're all strapped for resources and we're all under very tight timelines. And so sometimes it's hard to find time to eke out a whole testing regimen, you know, on a new update because you weren't expecting it. The only other thing I think, just generally speaking, that just any kind of sort of testing program would benefit is all of the states that we've discussed earlier that don't have a certification process in place. I think that, you know, having either kind of a set of core requirements, or at least a program that even their vendors can go through and say, hey, we're EAC certified to these requirements. I think it provides those jurisdictions that currently have nothing with something that they can then point to, especially when they're receiving inquiries about the integrity of their elections. They can say, well, hey, it's not that we just use these iPads and, like, you know, I know that, you know, your son can watch, you know, iPad, you know, do something on his iPad, but no, we actually kind of put a little bit something else on this. And so there's reasons why it's okay to use that. That's what I would really think would be a great benefit for those jurisdictions that currently don't have a formal process in place.
Thank you for that. And Director Poland.
Yes, I think the only thing I would add is that I think election officials should be involved in developing the standards. So that's really my only comment.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Kirk.
Well, I think I concur with everything that's been said on this question so far. You know, security standards are important, usability. I think one thing we haven't talked about yet is disabled access. You know, my voters now interact with my poll pads, so we need to make sure that they can interact with them if they have disabilities. And one thing that the Secretary brought up is auditability, which is so important. One thing I've given a lot of thought about recently, because I do have a poll pad now, there's a paperless solution that we're using as a paperless solution, is if every vote is so important, needs to be on paper, isn't the same true for the only record of who voted in that election? So I'm looking at using paper again next year for that auditability, so I can test. I've been audited against. And then the last thing is, I agree this needs to be an agile process. Things change quickly, but we can't sacrifice our security standards or other standards for the sake of agility because we're using COTS products. Those things have to come first. And, you know, yes, it needs to be agile. You can't take forever, but it does need to take long enough to be sure we're testing things thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Chairman Palmer, back to you.
That was really a great exchange. Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. I guess my question is a little bit different. You know, at the state level, whenever there would be a review or testing of a voting system or a poll book, in my experience, what is the product to be, you know, what's the product or documentation behind it, and who does it go to? And so is your recommendation, do you have a recommendation on, should it be a test report, the test data plan and a report that's sent to the state or open to the public? What is your, what has worked for you? What is the best practice on how you disseminate that information as a result of the test?
So,
Go
ahead, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer. No, that's interesting. I guess, certainly, we have to be transparent. And so our approval certification programs are open, to those who ask about it, to the extent that they don't, we also use the TLP protocol just to make sure that we are not, giving too much information that may, certainly impact the security of our system. So I don't know if I have, like, if you guys were doing the testing, we would want you to do what you do with voting systems and to certainly make that available to the jurisdictions and to the vendors and to those who are interested in having that information. But I do believe that perhaps at the state or the local level, some of the things that we also need to do with respect to certification and approval is to protect some of that, just so that we don't violate or compromise the security of our election system.
Thank you, Director Connolly.
Sure, thank you, Chair. I would just add on to that. I mean, we follow a very similar process here in New York. We do all the testing now internally. As part of that process, we do develop testing reports. We have two versions, one's public, one's confidential. The confidential one obviously goes to our commissioners, since it's up to the 4 of them to approve any kind of configuration before it can be used in the state. But obviously we also make sure that we're being transparent enough that we prepare a public version of our testing report so that anyone who wants to know how we went about it and what was tested can do so.
Any other comments on that, Ms. Poland or Mr. Kirk?
I'll jump in. As Dr. Connolly said, I would hope to be a public and a private version of the report, private to protect our security interests. But if you go through this testing process and I can't use it to reassure my voters, then have you really accomplished the goal you're setting out to achieve? Thank you.
Good point.
I agree with Director Kirk, and just give you an example, after the 2020 election, there were numerous times when I would get calls or emails from voters who are concerned about our tabulation system, and it was a good feature to be able to direct them to your website to say, here, you can independently verify that the voting equipment we use was certified by the EAC and by our Secretary of State by going here. So yeah, I definitely agree with both a private and public level of certification being posted.
Thank you. I'll turn it back to Vice Chair Hicks, I believe.
Thank you, Chairman. This is more of a question for the record, and because we have this information in our EVE survey, but just to get it out there to other folks who may not actually read our EVE survey. I don't know who those people are, but
Commissioner Hicks, Vice Chair Hicks, could you just a little bit
speak up a little bit more?
Just
Can you hear me
bit.
now? All right.
Yes.
Are e-Pullbooks used statewide in your state and or in just some jurisdictions? What do you anticipate this looking like in years to come? And as I was saying earlier, this is just a question for the record, as most of this is in our EVE survey. So we can start with Secretary Graffenreid.
So in Pennsylvania, it's increasing, very, very small number, 67 counties here, less than 10, but that's growing. They see the need, they get it. We're in the process of modernizing our state's voter registration and election management system. And so now with new election law changes here in the Commonwealth, starting back in 2019, the first, and I kid you not, since 1937. I like my new state, but they're a little slow. They're a little old. I don't know. But we're trying to modernize. And I hope that we will absolutely have more of our counties here using e-Pullbooks in the years to come. There are crazy laws that are still on the books here. Like, I'll give you a quick example. In Pennsylvania, when voters check in, most of the counties still use kind of like the old-fashioned, it's not a ledger, but it's close to it, and to sign them into the poll book. I mean, it is a poll book. And then the poll workers will write the name of that individual in duplicate, maybe triplicate, I'm not sure, on what is called a numbered list of voters. And some counties use carbon paper. Like, where can you find that? Oh my God, right? Or they use this little book. This is a numbered list of voters, and they write the voter's name. That's crazy, crazy, crazy. So yeah, we need E-Pullbooks in Pennsylvania. North Carolina, 100 counties. Again, all counties had to use the state's E-Pullbook solution for early voting. By the time that I left, I believe upwards of 65, 70% of the counties were using some type of E-Pullbook solution. The majority of them, the state's solution, and also a portion of those that were using, there was one, again, approved third-party vendor. So hopefully that is, higher as well, but we'll get there in Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Secretary Connolly.
I just got a promotion. I like that.
Wait a minute.
Actually,
did Tom get a promotion?
In the field promotion.
In New York, obviously, out of the 62 counties in New York, 61 of them are using E-Pullbooks. All of those, with the exception of 5, are using them for both early voting and election day. Only 5 of them are not using them for election day. I think that largely comes down to just a matter of resources and funding to purchase the equipment. As Commissioner Hovland pointed out, Hamilton County, with its 11 election districts and 4,600 voters, is the only county in New York that does not use electronic poll books. Again, I do think that's either a matter of a little fear of technology in general, or possibly a matter of resources to purchase necessary equipment. So we kind of adopted it fairly quickly. I'm happy that we do it with 3 vendors, like I said, and they are well represented throughout. So there's a nice kind of variety, but we do have a good working relationship with all of them. And, the customers, or the counties, certainly so far so good with their experience with each of their vendors.
Ms. Poland.
Sure. Well, E-Pullbooks in Ohio are used in 84 out of the 88 counties. Most counties in the state began to use them in 2017 after our General Assembly provided funding for the E-Pullbook. So yeah, 84 out of 88.
Mr. Kirk.
As I mentioned before, we have a statewide solution, so all 59 of our counties use E-Pullbooks. I'm a little concerned, based on things that are being said about the election last year, that there'll be a push in our capital this year to decentralize that and let counties go their own direction. Probably will be a mistake, and those are unfounded allegations. But the other thing I was going to mention, Secretary DeGraff and Reed, is we still do use numbered lists here. I deploy them to my polls as an emergency backup, a paper list, and numbered lists to go with, and a voter certificate. So you are not alone in that.
Thank you.
Absolutely do not have a problem with paper backup. I support it, strongly support it, but it should not be the primary system.
Thank you all for being here. Secretary Commissioner McCormick.
I got a change in title. Thank you, Vice Chair Hicks. During the general election in 2020, we saw several reports regarding E-Pullbook challenges. What are some of the things that you or your jurisdictions are doing to mitigate risk leading up to an election while using the E-Pullbooks? And we can start with Supervisor Kirk.
Thank you. I didn't see this problem here, but I think the one that made national news from Georgia last year was issues with our E-Pullbooks issuing cards first thing today. And as I understand it, that was due to an issue with how the data was transferred to the poll pad, or the E-Pullbook itself. We're mitigating that fairly simply, actually, by just adding another step to our testing process to make sure that after we do all the data transfers, the poll pad or the poll book still works and still issues a card to be read by our voting system. And we use that to great success in the last election.
Thank you for that. Director Poland.
Yes, definitely testing at the local level. As I mentioned before, that testing doesn't end after certification and acceptance of the E-Pullbooks, but this testing has to be ongoing prior to every election cycle. Having comprehensive checklists, just again, like we do with the logic and accuracy testing of our voting equipment. And it has to test all functionality of the E-Pullbook that we discussed earlier, not just checking in the voters, also checking the instructions that appear on the E-Pullbook screens that sort of guide the poll workers through the process. All of those have to be proofed. The communication between E-Pullbooks with other E-Pullbooks, and for those systems that have it back to the central system as well, and the central database. I think something that happened in Ohio, in Franklin County last November, is they were unable to use their electronic poll books on election day due to the high number of voters that had voted early. Ohio's had no fault absentee voting for well over a decade, but up until 2020, 70% of our voters in Ohio still choose to vote on election day. That shifted in 2020, and 60% voted early, either in person or by mail. And so Franklin County's E-Pullbook was unable to handle that large data upload in those final days, because our early voting in Ohio goes all the way until 2 p.m. on Monday, the day before election day. So when the county went to update those voters' records that they had already voted by absentee, their system just simply couldn't handle that massive of an upload. Luckily, they had the backup paper poll books in place, as actually our Secretary of State requires of all boards of elections in Ohio, so they could revert to their paper poll book. So I think that's just one example how you can test and plan for everything, and then one of those surprises happens on election day.
Yes, thank you for that. Director Connolly.
Yes, thank you. I would say that, obviously, many of the things that have already been said, I will be happy to echo. Our early voting goes to the Sunday before election day, and so we have a little bit more time than Ohio. It still can be very challenging. We did make sure it's challenging for a couple of different reasons. Number one, for the 56 counties that are using E-Pullbooks on election day, we do need to get the information from the early voting period. And with a far fewer early voting locations, it's easier to ensure that they have network connectivity so that the E-Pullbooks are connected back to the mothership or between each other. On election day, especially in some of the rural areas of New York, ensuring that you have proper connectivity to kind of get those updates can be challenging. That's one of the reasons why we made sure in our requirements that we had that all systems had to be able to update their systems manually, so that if they had to go out to each of those locations and put in some sort of a drive to import the voter history file from early voting, they could. I think that what we've seen is, despite some of those challenges, a lot of the counties have stepped up in trying to work with some of their local utilities, whether it be Verizon or any of their kind of connectivity carriers, to figure out if they can either install boosters or signal repeaters so that they can get more coverage in the areas where they're needed on election day.
Thank you. Madam Secretary.
Sure. Testing, absolutely. Test prior to election day. Training, right, is important as well. Providing, and then things do happen out in the field. So making sure that you have strong election day support, the use of rovers so that someone can be deployed very quickly to a polling site, and also making sure that there's attention to redundancy. So paper backup, again, is key, and just, really strong continuity of operations protocols, so that, even if there is an issue with your electronic poll book, we have in both of the states that I've worked in, we encourage county officials to train their poll workers to ensure that they do not, try to avoid turning voters away, and would not want a voter to be turned away due to a failure of an electronic poll book. And so having that paper-based system is important. And that also means having, a list of registered voters, even if the voter, will have to, vote a provisional ballot using that fail-safe measure. So, all of those things that we do as well for voting systems applies to e-poll books.
Right. And I think several of you pointed out the importance of training. I had heard a story about one jurisdiction where the poll workers were bypassing the e-poll books and checking people in. So that can cause problems if people aren't trained properly. So thank you all for your answers. We'll turn this back to Commissioner Hovland.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. And this actually concludes this panel. We thank all the panelists for being here, for sharing your insight and experience. And I'll turn it over to Chairman Palmer for his closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Hovland. Thanks for everyone who joined the panels today. We really appreciate your time. This is the first in a number of conversations and a series of conversations that we hope to have. The EAC wants to fit this program, the needs of all the stakeholders while improving security and providing a voluntary federal program. We're committed to transparency as we move through this process and look forward to getting more feedback from you and your colleagues and providing updates in the year to come on this program. Thank you again, and thank you for participating.